Welcome to the Threekit React DevKit demo, where we will be using the DevKit to create a web experience for a Threekit configurator. What does that mean? On the Threekit platform, we can create a complex product configurator using the attributes and rules system, but we still need to create a UI to house this product configurator in, as well as implement various integration features around it, such as wish lists and downloadable snapshots. That's where the DevKit comes in. Essentially, the DevKit contains an extensive and growing library of components and functionality that we can use as building blocks to create rich and exciting web experiences for any Threekit configurator. This library includes components to control attributes, to take snapshots and share URLs, to implement accordions and stepped forms, and many more. Along with the components, we also have easy access to the underlying functionality, making it easy to build custom components if the need arises on a project. Reaching for these components and features rather than building them out means that we can create better web experiences with less effort and time, and as importantly, with less expertise required. So let's get started with the dev kit. You can find the React dev kit in Threekit's GitHub org under the repository React Threekit. Here, the best place to get started is with the README in the repository itself. In the README, you'll find extensive documentation on getting set up for a new project, ways to deploy your project, as well as all of the features the DevKit offers and how they can be implemented on a project. Another great resource is the component library. Since most of the DevKit's functionality is wrapped in the components that it offers, this is not only a great way to explore the features that the DevKit is packaged with, but also documentation around using those features. To get set up with a new project, I simply jump back into the docs and navigate to our quick start. For the sake of the demo today, I'm going to be skipping these steps and jumping straight into implementing a project. This is the product we'll be using for our demo. It's called a kitchen single unit, and it has a fully built out configurator using our attributes and rules. To give you a quick example of the attributes that we have set up, we have some attributes that can control models. We have some attributes that can control materials. We have an attribute for the camera, which also toggles on whether we see the dimensions or not. And we have an attribute that can control the background color. As an example of the dependency, I can change my storage to be any of these options. I'll select a top drawer. And for my top, I have the options between selecting an equipment, burner, ice chest, sink, or leaving it at a countertop or none. If I choose an equipment, the storage has to be a door. So if I choose an ice chest, I see that the selection of storage changes to a door along with the ice chest coming in, and my storage attribute disappears. If I switch back to a countertop, my storage reappears, and I'm once more able to select what I want. So this is the product we'll be using today. After following the steps on the project quick start in the devkit readme, you should have the devkit running locally. And what you should see in your browser is very similar to the setup for that item on the platform. We should have the player on the left, the configurator form on the right, with the attributes laid out as a set of dropdowns. If I switch over to my code, I can see that what the devkit ships with is exactly this. I have two columns in my app, with the player occupying the column on the left and the form occupying the column on the right. Now, one of the first things I might want to do is start swapping out the components used for each of the attributes, specifically the material ones. I think it's more informative to show images of the materials being selected rather than the text. So let's go ahead and start making those changes. I'll go back into my form and I'll pass it a prop for attribute components, where I will pass in each of the attributes that I want to set the component for explicitly, and I'll mention the component that I want to use. So for the material type, I'm going to reach for the color swatch. I'll hit save, switch back into my browser, and after the page refreshes, I should see that my material now has a color swatch type component where I can see the color and have a better sense of what will happen when I click into it. Now, this allows us to target specific attributes within the form, but there's a chance that we might want more control over how the form is rendered. We might want to place content between the attributes, and we might want to organize the attributes themselves quite differently. And so the form can leave us a bit constrained in doing this. Instead, what we can do is rather than using the form as a contiguous unit, we can pull in individual components and assign them to individual attributes. So we saw something similar with the color swatch, which I will be using for this demo, and I will also reach for our buttons component. And I'll start rebuilding the form with one component for each attribute. We can start with top. Next we have storage, followed by all our paneling, left panel, right panel, back panel, and now we have our materials, which are wood type. For these, I'm going to use a color swatch. We have a finish, and we have a countertop material. I'll go ahead and hit save. And if I switch back over to my browser, I now see I have my attributes laid out using those buttons and the color swatches for the materials. Everything still works as intended. Nothing's really changed. All I've done is rebuild my form using the components for each attribute. Now, one thing you'll notice at this point is that the title and the description have disappeared. Those two ship by default with our form, but we can also include them in without the form, simply by pulling in the components for each of them, that's title and description, and adding them into my flow wherever I would need them. Looks good. Another thing we mentioned earlier was that for the top, if any equipment is selected, the storage defaults to a door and that attribute hides itself. So if I select a burner, the storage component will hide itself. Now, this makes sense, but it can be a bit unexpected for the user. So I think it would be useful to give them a bit of information about what's to happen when they make that selection within top. So I can switch over back to my code. I can go into my component for my top attribute, and I can add a description where I can mention that adding any equipment requires the storage to be a door. I can hit save, go back in. And now with that messaging on my attribute component, it becomes a bit more clear as to why this behavior might take place. Now I think my configurator form is starting to look good, but it's getting a bit cluttered. There's a bit too much visual information at any given point, and so I'd like to introduce a bit of structure to section off some of this information. To do this, I can reach for one of our layout components, and the one that I will reach for this example will be the accordion. And I know that for the accordion component, I also need to use the accordion item. Here, what I'll do is I will wrap all my attribute components inside the accordion, leaving out the title and the description. I very much want the title and description to sit above the accordion, so I'll make sure that those aren't included. And then within the accordion, as a way to create the various sections, I am going to create an accordion item for each of the section that I want. And for each of those, I can also assign it a label. So for the first section, I'll use equipment as the label. For the next section, I'll use paneling. And for the final one, I'll use materials. All right, we'll move our paneling over into the paneling accordion and our materials over into the material one. So our structure is quite clear. We have the title, the description, we have our accordion, and within the accordion, we have three accordion items. The first one, equipment, the second one, paneling, and the third one, materials. If I switch back over to my browser, I can see that I have my accordion rendered out where my form was and navigating through it. I can see that my attributes are arranged within the accordion the way I want, and everything still works just as expected. Now, the accordion might be useful for some projects where we're just trying to section off information, but for other projects, we might want to introduce more of a process of configuring, something where you progress through a series of steps. And for that, we can reach in for our steps component instead. So I'm going to swap out the accordion with steps, the accordion item with a step pane. And other than that, they all function very similarly. So I'll just swap out the names of the accordion and the accordion items with the new components, hit save. And with the steps, I'll also actually get rid of my title and description, just because I wouldn't want them as a part of my flow. And if I switch back in, I now see I have the same configurator loaded, but organized as a step configurator that I can proceed through. Again, everything works as expected. It's the same configurator, just organized differently. Now, one thing to mention at this point is if I refresh into this, the steps component loads before any of the data loads. And that's because the data is waiting to be sourced from the player, and it's waiting for the player to finish loading. Whereas the steps are just defined in the code itself, and so they can load immediately. But this creates a bit of an ununified experience. And so what I might want to do is have the steps load with the rest of the content. And there's a very easy way I can do that. We have a series of wrappers, one of which is called await player load, and it helps me achieve exactly this, where any of the content I place within the await player load wrapper will not be rendered until the Threekit player itself has loaded. So I'm going to put only my steps inside of it. I'll hit save, and if I switch back over to my browser, I see that while the player is loading, I don't see anything on the right, and once the player is done loading, all the content comes in together. Nice. I think my configurator form's looking quite good. Very happy with the shape it's taking. The one thing I'm going to do very quickly before I finish off is remove this gap. So I'll switch back over to my code. In the two columns component that's actually giving me both of these columns in as structure, I'm just going to specify that I want the column gap to be 0 pixels. Save that up. All right. So I'm happy with the configurator form. I think it's built out fairly well. And now the next step is adding some widgets. Specifically, I'm going to look for the share and snapshot widgets. Now what they do is the share widget allows me to share a resumable link for my configuration, and the snapshot allows me to specify cameras, which I can then, as a user, download snapshots from. All right, so for each of those, I'm just going to import them in. We have the share widget and we have the snapshot widget. And for now, I'll just place them both below the player. The share widget is fairly straightforward to use. It just requires the component. But for the snapshot widget, by default, it will get you the snapshot of whatever the user sees in the player. So if the user has selected a very specific view where they've zoomed into part of an item, it will be a snapshot of exactly that. Alternatively, I can also specify the cameras the snapshot's supposed to use. So as I showed before, the front and top camera, I have those set up specifically for taking snapshots, and I'm going to pass them into my snapshot component as the cameras that I want to use. Front and top. I'll hit save, switch back over into my browser, and we can quickly test both of these out. So let's start with the share feature. I'm just going to make a change to my configuration that's quite visually apparent. I'll click the share button and it says link copied. So if I go over into a new tab and paste in the link it copied out for me, I should see the player load with an ice chest and with the vintage selection for the wood. And that's exactly what I see. Okay, so the share button's working. Let's have a quick try of the download button. Now the download button has to acquire the images from both the cameras and render them out. So it takes a moment to put those pictures together, but once we have them rendered and downloaded, they should look exactly like what we need. So that's the view from the top, and let's have a quick look at the view from the front. All right, so my snapshot feature is working as well. Now, obviously the buttons look a bit clunky there. My recommendation for widgets is always to place them on the player, and we have a very convenient way to target where on the player you would like to place them. So if I switch back over into my code, I have my player here and my widget components below it. Instead of using the player as just its own component, I can actually pass in children. And the child I want to pass in is actually the widget container for where I want to place my widgets in the player. So in this case, within the player itself, I'm going to look for top right widgets, plural, and I'll place my share and snapshot component in there. Let's hit save, head back over to the browser, and we see our widgets load exactly where we want them to. I also can add labels to these widgets, either adding my own or using the default. So for example, if the share icon seems a bit confusing, I can go back into my code. I can say that I want it to show me the label. And if I switch back out and wait for the refresh, I see that the share button now also has a label associated with it. Now that I have my configurator form and widgets built out, I can start thinking about styling. Our dev kit uses a theme throughout its componentry as a way to define a lot of the styles, and this theme can easily be overwritten. For example, our primary color here is set to blue, which is used throughout our app to show selected and active states, hover states, and just accent colors. And it's very easy to change this over to a client's specific branding needs. If I change back into my code, so far I've been working in my app.js file, and now I'm going to switch over to my index.js file. To update the theme, I simply have to pass an updated value for the theme straight into the Threekit provider's config. I have an object already set up here, which is building out my config, and to it, I can just add a theme and update the primary color to one I find more suitable for the project, which in this case will just be green. Obviously over here, I can use any hex or RGB value, anything which CSS considers an appropriate color value. And if I switch back over to my browser, you'll see that all the places where I was seeing that shaded blue, I now see green. The last thing I'd like to talk about in this demo are tools. Tools are our way of adding new and interesting interactivity to the 3D objects that are natively tied to all the UI provided by the dev kit. Now, this can be a bit confusing, so I think the easiest way to understand what tools can do is by going through a use case. Let's say I have my configurator built out, I have my widgets added, and what I would like to do is be able to animate this door out so the user can see inside their configured unit. The way I would want the user to do this is that if they click the door animates to its left. I also want to make sure that the user knows this interaction is possible. So I'd want some kind of messaging to appear to them when they're hovering over the door that lets them know that clicking it can achieve this goal. To do this, I'm going to reach for my animate item tool and my tooltip tool. The animate item will get the door moving where I need it to, and the tooltip will present the messaging to the user. Now, like most of our tools, since we're tying it with the 3D, a lot of the implementation starts on the platform. So I'm going to switch over to my org on the platform, and I'm going to go straight to the door that I want to animate. Here, I'll add in some metadata. The first one is for the tooltip, and it goes under the reserved metadata value of underscore tooltip. And I'll add in the message I want the user to see, which can be click me to open and close. The next value will be also a reserved metadata property. It'll be for the animate item tooltip. And what I will mention is that it's a translate because that's the type of animation I want to achieve. And I'll mention the translation itself. So I want to move 1 meter along the x-axis, and I want this whole movement to take 1 second, or rather 1000 milliseconds. And that's all the setup I need in my item. I'll save this out and I'll switch over to my code. Here in the index.js file, I'll import out my tools. So there's the animate item tool and the tooltip tool. And I'll add them into my Threekit providers config object, which is where my tools need to be initialized within the array additional tools. And in this array, I'll not only pass my tools, but I will execute the function call for them. Looks good. I'll save this out, switch back over to my browser. And what I should see now is if I hover over the door, I should see that tooltip appearing as I specified in the platform. And if I click the door, I should see that it animates out, just the way I've described it. If I click it again, it animates back to its original position. So we can use tools to build a lot of interactivity with the 3D itself, and a lot of that interactivity can be tied into the UI in a very simple and native manner. So with that, we've implemented our configurator form, we've built out the widgets for our integration features, we've added some interesting experience features by using tools, and we have a complete web experience.